Today we're going to go back in my history and talk a little bit about databases. You ever wonder why persistence in a programming language is so darn hard? This is Bruce, and together we are Grokin. My first job out of college was with IBM Austin, and I actually went to the University of Texas to do some master's work in the area of database design and object-oriented systems. And I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience with persistence. To take a stroll down memory lane, I asked ChatGPT to create some persistence frameworks that I looked at. And when I was at IBM, I worked with enterprise Java beans, and you can see this one right here. This is one of the later versions of the model, and this is kind of the usage. And we had this kind of weird, difficult to sort out responsibility between what an entity manager is and what a class is and what a query is, and how these individual pieces work together. And this confusion got a little bit simpler to understand, but harder to use when I went to Ruby on Rails. So I'm going to scan down, and this is what it looks like when I do something similar with Ruby on Rails. So this is asking ChatGPT to do the same thing. And notice that we're using a framework called Active Record. And this is a lot cleaner in terms of what you have to understand. But there's a bit of messiness here that I want to call out. So we have these things called comments, and these are records, and these are easy to configure and wire together. But the problem is that there's a bit of confusion in that we combine the results of interacting with a database and the ideas about interacting with an individual record. And the result is that I have this code. Well, these are the migrations, but the result is that I have this code that when I interact with it, I actually try to save the post itself. Well, I shouldn't be asking the post to save itself. I should be asking the database to save a post, because that gives me the opportunity to separate the concerns of the database, which can fail, and a post, which after we've cleared kind of the messiness with user data, after that should be a relatively certain construct. So I lose the opportunity to separate the concerns of a failing API layer and what can be a mostly pure record layer. And as I worked with Elixir, here's the same thing with Ecto, the persistence framework for Phoenix and Elixir. And one of the coolest things that I ever saw, one of the most selfless acts, was when Jose Valum, the creator of the language, actually laid out a lot of his soul in building this database layer, even though it was something that's kind of difficult. It's kind of like this is the task that everybody gets that they don't want to solve because it's messy, it's hard, and it's really tricky. But Jose makes some really good decisions in here, and I kind of want to point them out. This is the schema, and if you notice, this schema doesn't have anything in it that can fail. So this is some metaprogramming, and the metaprogramming is going to allow me to create what's called a struct, or a description of a record, and then I can work with this record in this layer without kind of worrying about whether this thing can fail or not. And there are some other pieces of this schema that allow me to specify things like change sets. You don't see a change set here, but a change set is really a bridge between the functional core, or the things that can be certain, and the areas where we have more uncertainty, like where we're interacting with the database. So here's an example of interacting with this user. This is the change set, and you can look at this as a bridge between that certainty layer that describes a post, and this is user data. This is the poison in the system. If this was Scarface, this would be the cocaine. If this is Lord of the Rings, this would be the Ring of Power. If this was Oppenheimer, this would be the bomb. But this is what takes me from a certainty layer to an uncertain layer where I have something that might fail. So instead of trying to solve that problem as Active Record does in the post, I solve that in a different layer where I interact with the repo or the repository. So when you see repo in Elixir, this is the API layer for the database. This is where I work with things that can have the poison in the system, like the individual chain sets. And that layer of separation gives me a beautiful API. And you can see this separation, which is also done in some Microsoft frameworks. And in most modern persistence frameworks going forward, these ideas allow me to express composition and certainty in Elixir with pipes, which means really clean composition without having to consider failure. But yet, I can deal with more complex composition ideas like this idea of a chain set that embraces failure in the boundary layer or in the API layer. And so as a programmer, I like to look at things like persistence layers that tend to be areas with a lot of drudgery. And I like to look at them with the past in mind and the future and some of the decisions that were made by people like Jose and Eric Motors Johnson in the Elixir framework that make my life better every day. In this case, it's the separation of an API layer and a functional core. This is Bruce, and together we are Grokin.